Welcome back to the Faculty Factory podcast. I'm Kim Skorupski here at Hopkins, and I'm looking at Associate Professor Carisa Cooney. Hi, Carisa.
Hi, Kim.
Well, everyone, you're going to want to take a listen to Carisa Cooney's recent podcast, episode number 224. It was entitled Evolving Personally and Professionally to Maintain Job Satisfaction. And Carisa did such a great job that you'll love listening to that one, especially because I don't talk in it at all, which will be a relief for so many of you. Carisa reviews, she synthesized information and all this wisdom from three separate books. And I'm not going to tell you anything else about that other than you're going to want to check it out. So Carisa, again, is an associate professor here at Johns Hopkins. She's has a master's in public health and is a CCRP, which is a certified clinical research professional. And Carisa is also the director of education innovation and a clinical research manager in the Department of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery, again, here at Hopkins. And Carisa is a wealth of expertise, very beloved in the Department of Plastic Reconstructive Surgery because she has the wonderful gift of being able to take complex information and distilling it to diverse audiences. She gets lots of great feedback and recommendations and testimonials from people who learn from her. She did a great grant writing presentation, and we are really taking some good advantage of Carisa and her wisdom here at Hopkins. And she has been so gracious to share all her skills with us. And then also when I started learning more about her, invited her back to the Faculty Factory podcast. So today, Carisa, you're going to share with us something that you said you've been noticing the past 7 or 8 months now. Tell us what that is and then lead us into it.
Yes, well, thank you very much for this opportunity. And I would like to just point out that a lot of the quote unquote wisdom that I share is from, trial and error that I have personally experienced. So anything I can do to share my failures and recoveries to help prevent other people from falling into those ditches, I'm glad to do that. So, but one of those patterns that I've been noticing, I mentor a lot of students. I have over 40 pre and postdoc mentees who've graduated from, my research group at this point, is a real change from pre to post or pre to peri-COVID pandemic in mentoring. There's just been, I've heard a lot of other faculty talking about this. I've seen this myself. And so just wanted to help talk about what's going on in case people aren't familiar with some real things that are impacting medical students right now, and how I'm perceiving them dealing with it. My colleagues are perceiving them dealing with it, and then hopefully provide some tips on how to, head these misunderstandings that may come out of this, head them off at the pass. And so, one of the things with medical students in particular is there are some pretty big changes that have been happening with the training landscape that have come out of, these having to move to a virtual environment for teaching and learning versus, all this in-person learning that they had been doing prior to COVID-19. And I would dare say a lot of us who are now on faculty did not train during the COVID-19 pandemic. So most of our experience is in a pre-pandemic environment. And so one major change that happened recently is one of the important tests, of course, that medical students have to take, the step 1, has gone from a scoring system to a pass-fail. And so then what that has done is shifted, a whole bunch of emphasis and importance on the step 2. So switching that to a very high stakes test, as opposed to splitting it up into 2 different, episodes. And then what medical students have been doing to make up for this is try to augment their training in some way to further distinguish themselves. And that's particularly if they're going into a competitive specialty. So one of the ways that they do this, they'll potentially get additional degrees. They'll try to work in an MPH or maybe an MBA, something else they can do, relatively quickly in a year or 2, so that they're not prolonging their training too much. or at least their medical school experience. And then where I see a lot of folks is, people who want to distinguish themselves by doing research. The interesting thing about the research component is they're coming in and the emphasis is on volume, so quantity of publications, and not necessarily on quality of publications. And then when you have like this sort of, young, intelligent person who wants to do a lot, wants to be productive, but is in kind of a panic mode because they feel like they have a very limited amount of time to distinguish themselves, helping them understand that we don't ask a question just because we can. We ask a research question because we want to know the answer. Emphasizing that and saying, well, instead of getting 3 publications, we may just get 1, but it'll be a higher impact journal, or it'll be cited more often, or things like that. These are the messages we got to try to, better communicate with these young, bright people.
Yeah. Now, where do you think that message is coming from? I mean, I think this is kind of raising interesting issues about just intergenerational learning or differences between generations in general. I remember when I was, 20 years ago, it was, baby boomers and then millennials and then Gen Xers and I went to a presentation where they talked about the names that had been given to these different categories or classes of people and how they're different, and that kind of funny quips about, oh, if you're Gen Z, this, or, God forbid, try to teach millennial how to use a Betamax or a rotary dial phone or whatever, the kind of silly things of how we grew up in different cultures. So where does this frenetic maybe tension or anxiety about I need more come from? Is that in general across for that generation, or is it something with medical school, undergraduate medical training specifically, that is imposing this sense of urgency of filling your bucket with a bunch of stuff?
I think it could be a lot of different things, honestly. I mean, I know we as faculty are feeling, I think, an increasing pressure to publish. And so we are probably communicating this, this is like the invisible curriculum, right?
Right.
That we're communicating unintentionally to our learners.
Wow.
And I think there's other things going on here too, like the increasing rate at which we're expected to take in information. And so I think we probably feel a unspoken pressure to meet that bar. I don't know that that's appropriate, but I think that's a natural response that you potentially have to fight against in order to produce, better quality work. As opposed to, I can do this, I'm going to do this because I can and not because I should. Right.
Yeah. Our colleague, Dave Newsom, a neuroradiologist, our senior associate dean for faculty professional development, he's developed a lot of courses here at Hopkins. The economics of clinical operations, ECO, is one of them. But Dave and I co-teach this course, so we call it Get That Paper Out the Door. And it's the whole idea is that when I came up with WAGs, the Writing Accountability Groups thing, that there are basically 3 big reasons why we struggle with publishing. It's either you can't start, you lack the initiative just to get going. So how do you get started? How do you manage your time to work on it? And then making sure you don't let perfectionism get in the way of your finishing it, just submitting it like it's never good enough, never done. I can always do more. And of course you can always do more. But Dave Newsom talks about this idea of the Hope Diamond. So one big chunky, one big paper, the big paper that goes in Cell or Nature or whatever, or shaving off little bits of diamonds, making sure they're not cubic zirconia, they're real diamonds, but that least publishable unit, right? What can you carve off to get a paper, a real paper, like you're talking about, not just some garbage, versus that tension of maybe the PI, the famous principal investigator at Hopkins, who wants to just hang on to the data and analyze it and work for years until they get the big magnum opus. So that might be good for that big professor, but for the learners, as you're talking about, or the early faculty members, they're like, I can't afford to wait 5 or 8 years for the big opus. I need some publications. So there's always that tension of the big one, the big fish versus a bunch of little fish. And I think you're right, Carisa. It's the communicating the importance of quality over quantity, And yeah, anybody could go look up any paper and say, oh, that's an interesting question, or that's an interesting methodology. Let me just copy and paste and duplicate that methodology or that question in 15 or 20 other fields, or 15 or 20 different journals. And that's not science. You may come up with a bunch of statistically significant differences, but are they substantively or meaningful differences?
Right. One of the things that we frequently talk about, so folks during the pandemic, the kind of research that we were conducting changed a lot, because at least at Hopkins, a lot of the clinical research shut down because we just weren't doing as many surgeries. We weren't doing it. We weren't seeing as many patients. Everything got. A lot of my colleagues even got redeployed to work in COVID units, and so we had to rethink. Well, what resources are we going to use to do research? So we ended up doing a lot of secondary analyses of pre-existing databases, and shifting over to a lot of systematic reviews, and things where there are resources out there that you can use if you can get to them. But the issue with these secondary analyses of databases are huge, and people sometimes don't understand that when you have a huge sample size, your study is potentially overpowered.
Right.
You're going to have a statistically significant result, but
for everything.
but the information isn't clinically important, right? And so I think it's coming back to that base idea of, okay, fine, this might be statistically significant, but there's no take home here. There's no pearl that somebody's going to be able to implement in their practice to improve, treatment of patients or quality of care or things like that. So I think it really is, trying to make sure that we have our eye on the right prize, because I know it's easy for us to be like, oh, I got to get promoted. I got to do this. I got to get here. Like my, directors pressure me to do X, and that can get, communicated back unintentionally to our mentees as well.
So when you talk about med students these days are trying to augment their training and adding degrees to get MPHs or MBAs or what have you, is that kind of waiting to get into med school or in between med school, or when is that happening? Is there some trend that you're noticing there about that augmenting the training?
Yes.
Where's that happening?
I am seeing folks will usually do a research year between, their second and third years of medical school. That is kind of a more planned situation. Like if they discover the thing that they love and want to do earlier, in medical school. But I'm also seeing some other folks who are coming to me in their MS3, and because they've discovered later, oh shoot, I don't actually want to do orthopedic surgery. I want to do plastic surgery, for example. So then they have a bunch of research that's in ortho, and they want to augment their plastic surgery research presence. So they'll take a year off. And then after potentially doing a research year with me, I've had a couple of people say, oh, having worked with you, this is so flattering. They're like, now I want to get an MPH. Like, I don't know what to say to them about that. I try to talk realistically with them and just say, look, it's another year of your life. Training is long, like especially plastic surgery, it can be 6 or 7 years, depending on if you do a fellowship afterwards. So it can be a lot, but it's those competitive specialties. Like, what can they do to stand out a little bit more?
All right. Distinguishing ourselves. That's interesting. It's interesting. I think I see how that parlays into even once you are a faculty member. Oh my gosh, this happens all the time when I'm talking with faculty members who say, oh, I really, I'm super busy. I have this grant and I'm leading this program and I'm the director for this and I'm doing that. And I've got, 3 kids and I've got a partner and I feel like I need to get an MBA. And I'm like,
yes,
well, what? Why? And I'm taking a leadership course and I'm the president of my professional society and I'm traveling now and I'm doing all this and that. And the MBA, I'm like, why the why? Well, I just feel like I need to know more about that. I'm like, well, can you maybe read a book? Is it possible you could just do an old fashioned, just talk to somebody who knows about this? Why do you feel like you have to have the degree if you want to learn more about epidemiology? You can read some articles or go to YouTube and learn some stuff. I mean, so it's interesting how I feel like there's a certain, of course, a segment of us in society who we are just learners by nature. And so our default is, I just need another degree. I need some more letters. I need to learn more. And unbeknownst to us, if we don't think carefully, is we get caught in that habituated cycle of always needing to do. And then we're always in that kind of pre-burnout, mid-burnout stage. And we're wondering, like, I don't know why I'm just so exhausted all the time, but we're just accustomed to just working so hard.
It is really funny that you bring that up, because I had a colleague who, I think in her mid to late 40s, she was an MD PhD and plastic surgeon and doing what she wanted to do and working at Mayo. And she reached out to me and said, "Hey, do you think I should get an MPH?" And I said, "Oh, that would be great. That person could do all this, clinical quality research with you." And she's like, no, I want the degree. And I'm like, why would you do that? I assumed, because she already was the package, that she meant I want to get an MPH researcher to work with me, as opposed to like actually getting a degree. I didn't even understand what she meant because my mind was so blown.
Right.
But yeah, it's interesting.
It is. That's maybe a whole different podcast, but so back to this intergenerational mentoring pre and post COVID. So number one is this medical student training landscape has changed. I can definitely see how that changing the step one from a scoring to a pass fail is,
Right.
Puts a lot of changes in the way we deliver, medical school content and how we teach and how we interact. And then assumptions about what learners know and are expected to know and how they're expected to know it. Sorry, go ahead, continue.
And then, so also, so many classes had to go virtual. So there was much less in-person contact. And if you think about that, that's an important part of becoming a physician, right? Is how do you interact with your colleagues? How do you interact with your faculty attendings, your teachers? If you're not able to have a experience in your clinical years on the ward or in the OR or something like this, there's a whole bunch of nonverbal communication, a whole bunch of modeling that quite a few of our students now who are residents haven't seen. And then for those of us who, completed training prior to the pandemic, we're making a lot of assumptions about the knowledge base that these folks are bringing into that residency training. And so when we see someone who doesn't appear to have the same knowledge base, I think we unconsciously make assumptions too, like, oh, this person didn't learn this, like what's going on? And that person is losing, our entrusted ability, right? Mm-hmm. So we're trying to figure out, okay, where do we need to put this person? Like, what additional skill sets do I need to, teach them? And it's hard to figure out because you also don't know what the knowledge gap is unless you ask.
Oh, that's so important, Carissa. I'm so glad you mentioned that and reminded us about the assumptions, because everything we know in leadership and about relationships comes down to relationships. Leadership is all about communication and interpersonal communication. And a lot of that hinges on, you're so right, the assumptions we make about each other. So you're really raising the flag that we need to test our assumptions and test others' assumptions and make sure we're all starting up at a home base. You're also making me think of how, if we think diversity writ large, there's this intergenerational diversity too. Equity, diversity, inclusion, infusing diversity. The idea that there are diverse cohorts who came from diverse backgrounds, not only from their own personal backgrounds, but a social historical background. So you take generations, that could be wrapped up in that diversity umbrella as well, that we have a certain way of operating. And if you want to plug in any of the diversity, challenges, we like say men versus women, or if you're a man, orienting your perspective around a woman's perspective or vice versa, it's the same thing. Orient ourselves around post-COVID versus pre-COVID learning and cultures. So it really opens up the whole mind to diversity in its broadest, fullest sense. And doesn't all diversity stuff come down to our biases and our assumptions? So you're really hitting, I think, something really important. We all have to kind of take a beat before we jump into anything going forward, and recognizing, especially with younger faculty, younger learners and trainees, wait a second, Kim, let's start, back it up a second,
Right. As soon as you notice like sort of a disconnect, it might actually be, you're making an assumption based on what your training was like, and their training may have been very different. And I think something that makes this situation much more complicated is that the pandemic shutdowns were implemented very differently across the country. And so it's important to sort of understand, like, maybe you take, a little stock of, okay, well, remind me, where did you do your medical school? What was the shutdown situation like? You can have a little conversation, because they're also, if they're coming from Texas had very different, very few shutdown implementations there. I was talking to colleagues at MD Anderson, and they essentially didn't shut down at all. Versus Johns Hopkins, I mean, we were like 80-90% shut down. So, and all clinical research halted for about 6 months. So, very different formative environments. So just trying to get.
Start. That's such a great, easy piece of advice just before at the initial interaction. How about we do like what humans used to do? Hang on a second. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Remind me. I got your CV 3 months ago, but I don't remember. Tell me where you came from. And let me tell you why I'm kind of asking you your training environment, because you may not be aware that then you go on here at, Penn, this is the way we did that. So now everybody can go, okay, now I understand why you're asking me these questions, the learner is saying, or the younger faculty member, the junior faculty, early career. And then the mentor, instructor, more senior faculty member can get an appreciation of, all right, let's level up here, try to assess gaps or potential misfires so that we can appreciate where there are opportunities that we can kind of make this a good relationship versus one that we're talking over or under each other.
No, for sure. So it's been an interesting journey the last couple of years. And then some of the other things that I've noticed, and this is probably getting to more intergenerational differences, are just changes in technology that I'm sort of taking certain abilities for granted because I grew up pre-cell phone. And a lot of the people that I am mentoring now don't know life without a cell phone. We had an interesting interaction in the office recently where my folks have to call research participants, and occasionally they have to call back, but we don't really have landlines, many landlines in the office anymore. And so the trainees, the researchers, they all use their cell phones, and they can have like a phone number that masks their actual personal number, but they have to give a number to call back. So my research fellow thought that all of the office landlines had the same number and didn't really understand about how voicemail on the landlines works. And so then this patient's calling me back rather than my research fellow. And I'm like, we're all playing phone tag in a circle, and the research fellow isn't there to answer the phone, and I'm in a meeting and I can't grab the research fellow. And so finally I'm like, what is exactly is happening here? And this poor research fellow confessed to me that they didn't know how to use a landline, at which point I just busted out laughing, because what can you do? And I said, of course you don't. I'm so sorry. Let me explain how this works. And so I gotta love my research fellow for owning that, right? So then I could understand what the problem was and we could address it.
But Carissa, kudos to you for creating a safe environment where he could admit to you, because we can all think of situations where someone would say, that's the last thing I'm going to do is admit to Kim that I don't know what an SOP is. She keeps talking about SOP. Is she swearing at me? Like, what is an SOP? Why does she always scream about the SOPs? Oh my gosh. Yeah, the acronym, Standard Operating Procedures. I'm not saying anything nasty, although maybe it is. Some people do think an SOP is nasty. But yeah, it's so funny how in our heads, our own heads, we create all these stories and letters and numbers and symbols and meanings. And we say them a couple times, and I think, well, I've already said that twice. Surely by now you've understood that and processed that, where it's maybe in my head. And then I dare to be impatient with someone who's not getting it the way I've had it in my head forever. So it's such a great reminder to pause. And you think, but who's got time to pause? We don't have time. We don't have time. We don't have time. Well, you're going to pay for it in the end.
Yes.
If you don't take the time now. Do you want to be annoyed now for a couple seconds, or do you want to be repeatedly annoyed for every day or hour and week and months going forward? Which also then bleeds through to other things too, because now you're annoyed and you see that person, you're thinking, is this personal? What is with this guy? Why won't he, what's the deal? And then you tell yourself more and more stories and it escalates. And then you got a big explosion over something that could have been, oh my gosh, a minute later, here, let's stick some instructions on this landline and make sure everybody understands what that is. I mean, yeah, right? Everything relationships, communication.
But I think that is really interesting because you're kind of getting into this other situation that I found myself in. Generally speaking, I have pretty good social intelligence. But I have to say, there was a situation in my group that I completely missed that had been sort of on slow boil for quite some time, many months, I'm sorry to say. And because the fellows were very polite to each other, they actually each came to me and, I did little interviews to try to figure out what was happening. And each came to me and said, well, I don't want to throw so-and-so under the bus. Well, I don't want to throw so-and-so under the bus. And I said, look, guys, no one's throwing anyone under the bus here. We're having a communication problem. This is totally understandable coming out of COVID, where we're all talking to each other on Zoom. In addition to the fact that, what's your preferred mode of communication? Oh, I prefer face-to-face. What's your preferred mode of communication? Well, texting, voicemail, phone call, in person, it's all the same to me, which to me is just completely mind-blowing. But, getting that out front as well, because some people think texting is, brusque and not super friendly. And other people think if you just call someone out of the blue, that you're being extremely rude. So I would, particularly when you have a situation, if you were working together in clinical situation, you need to know what's the best way for us to communicate. Like if you're going to write me a book, don't text me, pick up the phone.
Right.
You got something quick, like a lab that I requested, texting's fine.
Yeah. I like those boundaries. That makes sense to me. That's in that you're reminding me of something that I think we so misfire is misusing forms of communication or treating them all equally. So the texting, the calling, the emailing, the voicemailing, which nobody does anymore, rarely, that we think that's all the same. And you're right. To me, nothing is more annoying than an email that you open up and it's 7 paragraphs long, and embedded in those 7 paragraphs are like 13 questions. And they're like, get back to me. What do you think? And I'm like, get back to me. What do you think about all of this? What? It's so dense. And then your brain goes, later. So of course you put it later. So it's, in the subject lines, try to be very specific. What is it? And not like, hey, here's that paper. Give me your feedback. That's even not good enough. Like, what level of feedback are you looking for? Are you looking for grammar, punctuation? Are you looking for readability? Are you looking for scientific, thought process here? Do you need help with the discussion? Want me to look for gaps? So that, as specific as you can get, is helpful. At least that's what we kind of teach in our leadership programs. But even beyond that, it's what you mentioned earlier, Carissa, the social and emotional intelligence to recognize that everybody is different and has different preferences. So as a leader, we have to understand that, try to take time. How does Carissa Cooney like to get information? How does she like to make decisions? Is she a sensor or an intuitor? Is she a thinker? Is she a feeler? And then I can figure out, okay, now that I know her and then I know myself, where might we, butt heads, or where are we going to be smooth like butter? And then learning to calibrate or pivot our interactions or our boundaries depending on with whom we're talking. So I have different like rules, if you will, for different people. I know that one person who works on my team, she's a phone caller. That's more efficient for her. And so that's just, I generally don't like phone calls, but when it's her, I know that's the most efficient way to deal with her, because I've tried the ABC 1, 2, 3 specific emails, and that does not work as well as just her having to talk that out. So that's totally fine. So you can have different, I imagine it's like if you have kids, you have different rules for different kids. One kid giving him a timeout to go to his room will think it's horrific and the biggest punishment ever. And other kid you send to his room might be like, I love it. This is my joy. I'm creative and I like the solitude. So you have to learn to, meet people where they are. So I like the way you're thinking about that, communicating and understanding and appreciating where we mess up, again, because of assumptions.
But you bring up a lot of interesting points. It's interesting for me. It's sort of like, how many text messages are into this conversation are we? And that's the point at which I'll potentially pick up the phone. But again, that's more like on a colleague to colleague level. So somebody probably has the similar, feeling for phones as I do, right? Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to think about this in other ways, and still like the residents are still sending huge texts where you have to scroll to get all the information as opposed to picking up the phone. So it's challenging. And then I personally am used to working with surgeons. I've been working with surgeons for about 15 years now or so. And so I'm trying to deliver as much information as efficiently as possible. So, if I'm sending a paper and I'm asking them to review it, I say, please go to page 4. I've inserted a note there with the question. This is the question I just want you to answer. If you could just do that and please send it back. I'm being like, really, where can they just, insert scalpel, cut here.
Efficient. So see, Carisa, that's another beautiful example of efficiency, but you calibrating your messaging and your need for information to that audience member's sensibilities. Mm-hmm. I hope everybody heard that. I'm trying to communicate to surgeons who do surgery, who are very adept at understanding, pinpointing, laser beam on something. So it would be a death knell it would be torture for you if you're going to communicate with a surgeon and say, hey, let me know what you think about this, and then sending them a 42-page paper.
Yes.
What? That'd be so unfair and sad and maybe comical or enraging, whatever. It's inappropriate. But to some other group, I can imagine, I'm not going to make this up completely. Imagine saying, hey, sending a JPEG or a picture to an artist and saying, give me your, responses to this or your reactions. Let me know what you think about this. Someone with that kind of a perspective, like a beauty or design element or contrast or scale or scope or, depth, they'd probably be able to tell you a lot because that's the way they live is they look at maybe big wall art and they're like, yeah, I absolutely understand what's going on here, or designer or HGTV. Now I got to put my HGTV hat on and looking at a designer of a space. You wouldn't need to tell them, what is that chair there? They could have a sense for that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that taking that time to test our assumptions about the person with whom we are communicating or trying to build a relationship, assuming, again, another assumption, that we're trying to build a transformational relationship versus transactional. If you have no intention of dealing with this person beyond 5 minutes, well, who cares? But to be as mean and dumb as you want, because it doesn't matter. But most of us, mature people are trying to be transformative. So that does kind of like take some probing and testing our own assumptions about what this person wants and how they want it. But how do you balance that, Carisa, trying to, like, as a leader, so those of us who are listening to the podcast and we're putting our mentor, our sponsor, our coach hats on, and we're thinking about the trainees and the students and the postdocs and the fellows and the residents and younger faculty members. How much do we compromise when we're trying to do this? So I'm envisioning some people going, are you kidding me? Now I got to do more. I have to learn more, emojis, and I got to learn how to text using letters and emojis and things. Is that fair? How much do we compromise? Where is the line between my saying, listen, if you're going to work with me, this is how I work best and most efficiently. If you send me, like Carisa Cooney does, if you're very direct to me and send me, please look at this page. This is the thing. This is very specifically. Or do I say, well, this learner doesn't work like that, so I'm going to have to bend over backward and do a double, triple, sow cow flip, double whatever to get that person where? How do you draw that line? And How do you do it? Or what do you think?
Well, this is a great question. So I think to a certain extent, some of my selection of mentees, right, is I'm self-selecting for people that I feel I'm going to be able to mentor well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely some bias that I'm introducing in my sample. And so if you're in more of a situation where you don't have a choice and you have to be mentoring these people, I think if you can have a conversation in which you compromise, in terms of the communication style. I think that potentially can work. At some point, you're going to bump into somebody who there's no compromising, right?
Right.
And that will definitely be challenging. In which case, you want to bring in like your program director or your department head or someone else to say, okay, I need some help here because we're just at loggerheads.
Right. Right.
But I think if you at least, even as a leader, if you demonstrate a willingness to meet someone halfway, I think most reasonable people are going to, appreciate that and try to do the same.
That's good. That's fair. That's so fair. Is when people can see that we are authentically trying, we are making an effort, like because it's important that we have boundaries and standards, SOPs, standard operating procedures. We're not going to change our whole lab to accommodate your preference for whatever, fill in the blank. There are certain scientific, legal, ethical, moral expectations around how we do work here in the lab or in this clinic or in this, committee. And yet we appreciate that the person who is now talking to you is a fill in the blank, whatever all the titles, degrees, status, power, position, history. And therefore, I'm not the keeper of all truth. I have ownership of this grant or this project, or I lead this clinic or this thing. And yet I'm always open to new ways of thinking about things, improving. And certainly communication is imperative to the success of this project. So you demonstrate that you teach us, help us level up without compromising the work or the science or the responsibility that we have to steward this taxpayer money or this, foundation money or this patient experience, So I think that is, you hit that on the head, because I'm just always envisioning poor faculty. We're always asking them, it's like they have to do more. It's always more. We never involve the faculty development and say, hey, we got great news. We've come up with ways we do less, do less, do fewer things. It's always, well, come to this session to learn more stuff about how you can do less stuff. I mean, it's always, I think of faculty going, that's something else I have to learn how to do now. Are you kidding me?
I would totally flip this and say, if you can spend a few minutes up front, just a few minutes to try to get that baseline, of how this interaction is going to work, you will save yourself a world of pain downstream and time and, spare yourself from having to straighten out miscommunications or huge mistakes. If you don't appropriately set the expectations for whoever's coming into your lab and they're coming from a completely different environment, learning academic, cultural, personal environments, I mean, that person doesn't have a chance. And here you are coming in and saying, well, I expect you to do this. Well, you never told me that. How was I supposed to get here? So one of the things that I do, and I kind of apologize to people as I do it, but I have the same introductory research presentation I give everybody. I say, okay, if you've done your, IRB modules, a lot of this will be familiar, but I cover this with everybody just to make sure everybody's on the same page, just so it's very clear, even looking for the dress code at Hopkins, it's very difficult to find.
I didn't even know we had a dress code, and I never even thought of. See, you're raising my antennae to something I would never have even considered. Again, because of my generation, I would never think that you'd have to tell someone how to dress to go to work in the world. But go take it. Teach us like what's going on, because I can't imagine.
Yeah, in the clinic space, there's a different dress code than if you're in a non-clinical space. So the non-clinical space, I think it's, largely up to, that environment. Certainly a lab, you're going to go in with protective clothing, make sure you have the PPE, the personal protective equipment that you need. But in the clinical space, basically, it's considered rude to show your armpits. So you're not supposed to have a sleeveless shirt. If you can wear a sleeveless shirt, but you have to have a jacket or a white coat over it, right? And then another thing, it's a safety precaution, is to have closed-toed shoes. So a lot of, women in summer would like to wear nice sandals or open-toed shoes. Well, you could do that in the non-clinical space or on a day when you're not seeing patients. But the whole idea there is if you drop a sharp, you want your feet to be protected. And then interestingly, I'm not sure how this is shaking out now, but at least a few years ago, there were certain places, I don't think this is true at Hopkins, but ladies that wanted to wear skirts or show their legs had to wear pantyhose.
Oh my gosh. And people are saying pantyhose? What are pantyhose? I'm sure there's some people going, what are pantyhose?
I'm totally dating myself with that one. But it's important, to bring these things up. And then there's great data behind like why you should wear a white coat. And so someone might not want to wear a white coat, but when I have these young people coming in and they look very young, they look younger all the time, right? But I say, if you wear the white coat, you will demonstrate that you are a part of the team to the patient, and they will take you more seriously, regardless of, how old you look. Mm-hmm. So great data on that. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But yeah, there's reasons that we have these dress codes.
Yeah. And I can imagine the post-COVID stuff where I know have friends who have kids who they started off their college existence in COVID. So they were stuck at home for a year, creeping up in a year and a half, never interacting. So they're sitting at home wearing sweatpants and slippers. And I imagine, I know there are faculty here at Hopkins who've been hired, and they were hired during the quarantine days where they never even went on campus. So like, welcome to Hopkins, nice living room or nice family room you've got there. And that was it. That's it. Like that. Right. So how do you bring someone into and then make assumptions when you never even see them? They're just like avatars. It's a whole different set of assumptions that we're making, even with ourselves when people are coming back. Like we're assuming that, all right, well, just back to business as usual. Business is normal. Nothing is usual. We can't go back to the way we were. It's all these expectations of good. We've got like a session in person now. It's going to be just like old times. And every time I go back for an old time thing, it's like, this is not like old times. There's nothing about this that's like old times. We can't forget what happened the past for 3 years now. Everything's different now. And so we can't make assumptions about the way we used to work. That's not the way we're never going to be that way again.
No, absolutely. And I think you bring up another interesting point. Certain people could be in a situation where they don't have the right clothes to suddenly go back to work in person, either because their weight changed during COVID or there was no to buy those clothes coming out of training or coming out of school. Mm-hmm. And so they're like, well, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to get a suit. I mean, and as I'm working from home today, I have no positive comments for my outfit.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other irony there is like, I'm like, well, who cares? I remember when the COVID first happened and we saw our boss of Icedean for the first time, like in a hoodie, and it was kind of nice. I was like, oh, she's like a normal person, and their people are like people. And so the longer we are in the Zoom options and seeing people, to me, it's you look past and you realize how silly, like all the weight and the importance we put on. Now, I can obviously see this both ways. So I'll look at the good ways, like who cares what people are wearing? Who cares if their hair's in a ponytail and they got a hoodie on? The brain in there is still wearing the tuxedo. The brain's a good brain. It doesn't care what clothes you put over top of it. Now, the other side of that argument is, all right, so if you are in the hospital space and I'm walking around with my hair, ponytail and a hoodie and my slippers and sweatpants, it conveys a different message to patients or customers that this is perhaps not a professional environment. And you would maybe question the person you're working with who's going to wait on you if they looked like they were dirty or unkempt. So you would make other assumptions that it would not give the right tone or the vibe that we want to convey. Like, no, you're coming here, you're coming to a 5-star place. We got you. We're going to take good care of you. So I can see both sides of that.
I think the bottom line is we have to think about how we're going to be perceived and try to inspire confidence in the people, confidence that people have for us in the service that we're going to provide. Whether, I'm trying to sell my services to, a researcher or a grant mechanism, or, to a patient that I'm going to consent for a study.
Right. And it also gets back to like what you're talking about, this intergenerational mentoring, that making sure that we as leaders and senior faculty members convey to the next generation of learners, this is not a personal thing, Carisa. I'm not trying to have this conversation with you because it's something about you personally. It's an orientation to this is the culture coming out of COVID. I know we're all this, but when we are here, this is the expectation. These are the boundaries. This is the way we live and do business around here. And so here are the policies around this, that, or the other. Universally applied.
And to also say, if you adhere to these policies, it's going to help you be more successful, with the patient or with your colleagues or your superiors.
And explaining the why. I mean, to me, it's like the way you describe that, I think there's a big difference between saying, Carisa, I see you're wearing those sandals again. No sandals. And then walking away like, what is her deal with my sandals? Versus saying, hey, I noticed you got those nice sandals on there, but the policy is no open toe because some, there are sharps, there are heavy instruments, Oh, now I get it. It's not like she's just a jerk. She's looking for my armpit for some reason. No, this is a policy because to help, because I'm making an assumption. Right. Well, she knows darn well why. Maybe she doesn't know why. Or maybe she doesn't know why that white coat conveys authority. And then that will, let me explain that to her. So then, yeah.
So the other thing that I struggle with a little bit is trying to explain why it is important for people to come back and work in the research office in person. And so, because, it's so convenient, and comfortable to be at home and all these things. But it's, getting that inspiration from a casual conversation, right? Or being able to just come over and say, hey, Chris, I have a quick question. Can you help me? And then and then we just scoot the project along, more efficiently.
Yeah. So I said we have that, not only that, but even this sounds dumb, but like the gossip or overhearing things, and not like gossip, like juicy gossip, but how many times would you be working or walking or in a classroom or in a hallway or in the cafeteria line and just hearing conversations gives you ideas. So it's not like the gossip about like dirt about somebody, but you learn what's happening.
Oh, absolutely. Ideas
at
for
different levels. Yeah. It just, you, and when you're not getting that, you think, well, I didn't need all that stuff anyway. No, that's a lot of context that can be important for you to know personally as a department, as a division, as a center, as a unit, and then engage, like peep around the corner. What was that, Chris? I couldn't help it over here. I just heard you told so-and-so about the meeting and such. What's happening there? I didn't hear about that. What was that? So all that kind of culture stuff that you miss.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also, for folks who are learning how to communicate on Zoom, there's a lot of jokes about the delay. And how do I read body language? I should stop talking now. If your people, I've definitely noticed this with my more recent trainees, where they're not getting the nonverbal cues like other, previous trainees have. Now I know there's always like, different levels of that emotional social intelligence there, but I'm definitely seeing it in higher levels. So, and I think then that is also leading to this avoidance of conflict in certain situations, which was that situation that I dealt with. And then when I had to like force, the situation, we had a group meeting and be like, hey, we need to talk this out. And someone just wanted to stop. They just didn't want this anymore. And I said, no. We just got to lance this and get it all out in the open so that we can move forward. This isn't about blame. This isn't about, punishment or anything like this. We just got to move forward. You don't have to like each other, but you do have to work together. You have to respect each other. So, trying to move past like a lot of, miscommunications that I think are coming out of this very difficult social period.
Mm.
And then letting them know, like, that's part of my job, is to help you guys get through this.
And that I love that, Carissa. I love that you're sharing that kind of when you said, no, we're not going to avoid this, that we're not going to just end meeting and click out of the Zoom. No, the doors have been locked. They would not be allowed to open during flight. Everyone's buckle in, because we're not landing this plane till we get through this turbulence. So I like that. That is another really important thing of teams. And yeah, you can build teams. And I'm sure there are industries right now who would be laughing, going, well, we've been working remotely. I've never met people. They're in halfway around the world, or they're in NASA. They're in a different planet. Yeah, we work well. Thank you very much. And yeah, as human beings, yeah, those nuances of body language and tension, it's hard to feel that on virtually. So yeah, I imagine there's going to be maybe some more anxiety around being with other people, because we're just a group of people who the past 3 years have not learned that and not gotten comfortable with that. And now even post-COVID, when you've got their supposed colleagues or mentors who aren't even coming in regularly like they used to, there's not as much opportunity. So even if they do get shoved back into fill in the blank, the clinic, the lab, the committee meeting, the whatever, the faculty meetings, even, people are still remoting in and hybriding in. And so it's going to be a tough bunch of years. It'll be interesting to see how the next generation of academics and faculty members work through these years of not having had that foundation like many of us did, of being in a group, in community with each other, that we may have lost some of that, the art of medicine, just by not being around each other.
Yeah. And this is something, right now we're really talking about these folks who experience this acutely, coming through. So in medical school, perhaps an undergrad transitioning to medical school transitioning to being resident. But I think we really have to be paying attention for those of us who, anticipate being in the field for another 10, 20 years, and look at how this data that's coming out of elementary schools and, middle schools, what is these learners' experience, and how is that very difficult experience at a very early age going to impact them as our future doctors, our future surgeons and researchers? Because there's some crazy behaviors that they're seeing where, the kids who are sitting in remote learning, they can get up whenever they want and use the restroom or get a snack or get a drink. And then they're doing that in the classroom as well. And then the teachers, don't have power over this dynamic anymore to really do effective disciplinary action. And I realize I'm going way earlier in the pipeline here, but I think we're definitely going to see this coming through.
Fair. That's really fair, Carissa. That's a really good observation. Are we going to end up with cohorts of young professionals who can just check out? They don't have the focus or the attention span. They add another layer of social media and TikTok and Instagram and that kind of scrolling kind of fast hitting adrenaline hits, that they're bored. They're like, I'm checking out, just stand up and leave out of that. They can't, or there be a certain level of discomfort or being uncomfortable in group settings with, on patient doing rounds or in a auditorium or in a professional conference, or that they just disengage, just get up and move and leave. And when things get dicey or the temperature gets hot, just, swipe left.
Or having a lower, ability to have that difficult conversation, right? The patient's passing away and you have to deliver that news to the family, or you have a serious interpersonal, problem, miscommunication with a colleague. What are those kinds of interactions going to look like, moving forward?
Yeah, we have to be mindful of that and think of strategies. And again, all coming back to testing assumptions, testing our own assumptions, taking a moment to build relationships. And then it sounds like there's lots of opportunity for people like you and me to come up with new ways of reorienting the older generation as well as the younger generation to come to these compromises to keep the high standards of patient care and research and science and discovery and writing and all those things. So interesting. Job security, right? Job security. Well, Carisa Cooney, did you have anything else you wanted to share with us today on bridging the gap, the post-COVID intergenerational mentoring topics?
Well, I think there's one other thing I'd like to add, and it's just this expansion in the medical education space, both in UME and GME, so undergraduate medical education and graduate medical education, and that's the implementation of entrustable professional activities. And this may help this better understanding of making sure we're getting people to the point where they're meeting all these different things. We can tick them off more easily. But, when we have people who continue to have these gaps, just because, that 6 months that they were supposed to be on this rotation, they actually had to be at home and got flipped to, reading and research projects. They may continue to have that gap coming out. And so how do we get them back up to speed? Because, they're not demonstrating that they're entrustable on that clinical skill or those surgical procedures.
Yeah, take a moment. Carisa, what is the entrustable professional activities? What does that mean for those of us who don't deal in education that way?
It's an interesting concept where they're trying to break up complex procedures or complex interactions, right? Like, oh, well, go see the patient, figure out what's wrong, and report back to me. That's not 3 things, right? That's more like potentially 20 different things. And so trying to break up that, clinic interview into chunks so that you can assess, well, how well did you parse out like a differential diagnosis? How well did you, do the background of the patient, establish like medical history, do these different things. Okay. And so then you can tick those different things off. That's more specific, say, to medical school. And then, in the surgery space, it's like, how well are you doing the surgery? How well are you orienting the patient in terms of like the risks and potential benefits of the procedure, these kinds of things.
So what you're saying is that competency umbrella, if you will, because of changing from scoring to pass fail, because of COVID, they're literally cohorts of students out there who didn't get this or didn't do that, and they were passed through, and now they're maybe subpar. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think it's that we're trying to convert over. Entrustability is where we want to graduate people, right? In medical school and particularly in residency, so that they're capable of, independent practice. And so if we don't feel that they're entrustable, why is that? Is that because they had a curricular gap because of the pandemic situation and because the educational environment, medical education environment is training us towards entrustable professional activities? Perhaps we're setting up a certain number of people to fail in this space. It's definitely an evolving situation. But when we're looking to entrustability and we're using, assumptions and biases or, our past experience to judge this, are we really being fair? And what else can we do to help get these folks up to speed, given this crazy, shared experience that we've been through?
Yeah, gosh. And now I'm going to go back on another one of my tangents that gets to diversity. And this may be a nutty metaphor, but if somebody makes the major league, so if you get, say, football players and they get drafted, they're in the NFL, they get to the team. Let's just pick any team. Let's just say the Pittsburgh Steelers, just for no reason whatsoever other than that they're my favorite team. So they get to the Steelers. They were drafted to the Steelers or on the Steelers team, but they came from different backgrounds or different schools and high schools and colleges that had varying degrees of resources and coaching and equipment. And they're good enough to get to the Steelers. And yet there's an assessment of just gaps. Like you can't assume that everybody who gets to that caliber has the same level of boxes having been checked, because they're coming from different backgrounds, and you can't assume that they all speak the same language, or maybe they had a great, strength coach, but they didn't have a good flexibility coach, or da 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 da. So that's what that's what it seems to me, that we're all getting to the place, but we're getting there different ways. And so you can't make assumptions that, well, if you got here, you're just like me. No, you got here, you deserve to be here, and yet you have different strengths and opportunities. So let's make sure we're all at the same starting line before we, pop the starter pistol off and take off. Hang on a second. Let's make sure, do we all have the right shoes on and equipment, and let's train each other up to make sure that we're all on the same team, equipped, ready, and now we can go, versus making that assumption that, well, how could you not have known that? Didn't you come from, Stanford? Didn't they teach you that at Stanford? Whatever. You get my point, right?
Yeah. No, it's a crazy educational landscape right now.
Yeah.
So
good stuff. Okay, folks, this was Carisa Cooney, Associate Professor here at Hopkins. Good stuff, right? You can get a hold of Carisa by emailing her at ccooney, CCOONEY 3 at jhmi.edu. Or just go to the facultyfactory.org and you'll see Carisa's face and a description of this podcast episode and any other topics you want to present to, bring to, or sponsor some friends and colleagues to be on the podcast. Just send us an email and we'd be happy to have you on. Thanks, Carisa. Again, you're wonderful. Thanks for all your ideas and for sharing yourself and your wisdom with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's Kim Skorupski in the Faculty Factory. Just a big thank you for being a part of this vibrant international community where we all share our tools to build academic leaders. Did you know that the Faculty Factory podcast, for almost 5 years now, dropping episodes every Friday, has had almost 70,000 downloads and YouTube listeners from 84 countries? We're waiting to learn from you. Would you please shoot me an email so that we can record your episode? Or maybe you'd like to sponsor someone else to be on the podcast? Our email address is facultyfactorykim@gmail.com. The address at Hopkins here is K Skorupski. That's KSKARUPSKI @jhmi.edu. And yes, all the episodes on the Faculty Factory podcast are also on our YouTube channel. We have a YouTube channel, and the YouTube channel is sorted into buckets for your easy viewing. Let me look at these buckets and tell you what they are. Discussions with deans, communication, general faculty development podcasts and interviews, promotion and tenure, reunion episodes from great speakers from the past and guests from the past, the habits and hacks from Hopkins. We recorded that during COVID when we were all kind of hunkered down. Self-awareness and self-management, leadership, networking, research and scholarship, and mentoring and coaching. So again, that's on the YouTube channel. Then did you also know that the facultyfactory.org website has drawn almost 37,000 visits from users in 122 countries? If you go to facultyfactory.org, we've put together a lot of resources for everyone to share. Not only will you see the podcast, but under resources, we have coaching resources. We have our ebooks. We have all the institutions. Yes, if you're listening from any other institution, any school of medicine in North America, your institution is listed there under resources with a link to your Office of Faculty Development or Faculty Affairs. If we have the wrong address, give us an update, but that's a really neat way of seeing all the schools in North America. We have related affiliate organizations, so the Association of American Medical Colleges, affinity groups, and other partner groups that you might be interested in that do faculty development. And then scholarship, we have a link on tons of scholarship around faculty affairs and faculty development, so you can check that out as well. And then we have a blog, and there's places to contact us on the website as well. So facultyfactory.org, you can send an email directly through the website. We also have a Faculty Factory Twitter channel. You might want to join us there. And then we have 2 free ebooks. We're working on the 3rd, spoiler alert, but 2 free ebooks you can send to all your colleagues, friends, faculty members, learners, trainees. One is called the Snippets for Success. That's all of you around the country who shared your tips and tricks for being successful in academic medicine. That's a free ebook sitting there waiting to be downloaded. As well as, again, during COVID, we did habits and hacks from faculty members here in Hopkins. They shared their wisdom around how they built their careers, how they overcame certain hurdles and challenges. That's another ebook you can take a look at and share with friends. So thank you again for listening to the Faculty Factory podcast, for being a part of our community. Will you please tell someone today about the Faculty Factory podcast? These Faculty Factory efforts are supported by the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and our wonderful Vice Dean for Faculty, Dr. Maria Oliva Hemker, and you, our loyal patrons who share our passion around the world for faculty career and professional development. Thanks, everybody.